Now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about planning for instruction and tests. We're going to talk about identifying instructional goals. We're going to talk about assessing group characteristics, and we're going to talk about relating instructional goals and objectives to your instruction and to your tests. So the first thing is identifying those goals and objectives. What is your goal? What do you want students to be able to do after you've taught a lesson? That's the most important thing. If you don't have a goal, then you're not going to have a direction on how to reach that goal. So before you can decide how to teach, you've got to decide what to teach and your goals for instruction and how you're going to teach it. That's going to lead you to how you're going to teach it. Are you going to use group instruction? Are you going to use individual? Are you going to use projects? What is it? How are you going to teach that lesson? Educational objectives. Students should be able to read well. If you want an explicit instructional objective, that is, what do you want students to be able to do after you have taught the lesson? That's the difference between a goal and an objective. The goal is very broad. Students will learn about art. Students will learn about fractions. Students will learn about interviewing techniques. Whatever the topic is, whatever that outcome is, that goal is very broad. Your explicit instructional objectives lead you to that goal. So for an example, given a paragraph, students will be able to identify the main idea. That is an objective. Your objectives need to be both measurable and observable. You got to be able to look at it, see it, are they doing it, are they understanding it, and then you got to be able to assess it. When you're looking at your goals and objectives, you need to determine the objectives, you need to describe the activities to meet the outcomes. Are the outcomes met based on the activity? And then you need to pick an instructional approach. How are you going to teach this lesson? When you're planning for instruction, you have to make sure that you relate those goals or objectives to what you're teaching and your test. When you create a lesson plan, when you're planning, I should be able to look at your lesson plan and then go back to your objectives and say, yes, this student can master those objectives based on how they're teaching. If you're saying in your lesson plan that they're doing one thing and you're teaching another thing, those are not going to match up. So you have to teach them how you expect them to learn or what you expect them to be able to do after that. You've got to model that learning for them. The next thing I want to talk about is evaluation. You have to have an evaluation. You've got to assess your students, and then you have to evaluate those assessments. What did they do? What did they mean? What did they learn? Did they pass it with mastery? Did they just pass it with average? What did they mean? What did those results mean? Can you move on? Do you need to reteach? Those are things you need to think about after an assessment has taken place. Another thing is assessing group characteristics. You've got to look at challenges for schools, which is we have a lot more ESL students and we have special needs students in our regular ed classrooms. There are cultural and intelligence issues. You know, there are multiple intelligences on how students learn. If they're auditory, if they're visual, if they're hands-on. There's Garner's multiple theories of intelligences. There's different ways to teach different students. For instance, in this class, you do written stuff, I'm going to have you watch videos, you can read stuff. There's all kind of ways in hopes that I can reach all of you guys and girls. So it's being able to provide instruction. When I talked about progress monitoring or response to instruction, how can you respond to students who need a different form of instruction? And that's good instruction. And that's regardless. That's not just for your special needs, not just for your English language learners. That is for all students. And all teachers should be able to do that kind of stuff. Some of the thing that happens is teachers don't understand the cultural background for some of your students, and that's when you have some issues, or you think they're not listening or they're understanding. But that just may be that is disrespectful to them, and they don't do that like we do here in Alabama, or vice versa. There's just some things that teachers need to prepare themselves and try to do a little bit of background, a little homework themselves to figure out how they can meet those needs for their students. You might have to consider gender differences. You might have to consider your special needs students. Whatever it is, a regular ed teacher needs to be willing to work with their general ed. The general ed teacher needs to be able to work with the special education teacher, along with the English language learner teacher, the ESL teacher, for them to work as a group to figure out what is best for that student and how you're going to help that student meet those objectives and those goals and ultimately be successful and to pass to the next grade and have that confidence that they need. Let's talk a little bit about planning. When you're planning for instruction, you got to think about time frames. You got to set instructional goals. You got to plan the activities. You got to set your priorities. You got to figure out what the material is. What do you need? What do you need to plan that lesson? You got to have time to do it. You got to manage your time. You got to create a schedule, and you got to be flexible, because we all know that things don't always go the way that we plan. So there may be instances where you have to redo something, or you can't finish it in time. So those are things to think about. You need to figure, like I said, the type of instruction. Are you going to do teacher-centered? Are you going to do teacher-led? Are you going to do strictly teacher instruction, which we hope you don't do? Are you going to do student-led? What is it that you're going to do? What type of instruction are you going to provide? There are obviously some teacher-centered instructional strategies: lecturing, explaining, demonstrating, question and discussion, seat work, homework. There's all kind of things you can do. But you want to make sure you challenge your students if it's seat work. You don't want them to get bored with that, and you don't want to give them something just to be giving them something. If it's learner-centered, you want the learner to be at the center of that, right? You've got to think about motivational and affective factors. You've got to think about strategies such as problem-based, discovery learning, inquiry. Those are things that are going to go on if you're going to do student learning or learner-centered type of instruction. Technology. Are you going to use technology with your education? You've got to figure out, are you going to use the computer lab? Are you going to go to the library? Are you going to use email? Are you going to do YouTubes like we're doing now? Are you going to do podcasts, wikis, blogs? Are you going to let them use their phone to look up stuff because they all have phones? So there's all kind of things to consider when you're planning for instruction and for tests. The next thing I want to talk to you about is going to be a little bit more detailed for instructional goals and tests, and that's going to be in the next part.